Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to this episode of Season 12 of Left to Black. And we are joined today by Professor Erica R. Edwards, Associate Professor of English and Presidential Term Chair in African American Literature at Rutgers University. She's the author of Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2012, and which also received the MLA's William Sanders Scarborough Prize. She's also the co-editor of Keywords for African American Literature, which was published by New York University Press. She is joining us here today to talk about her wonderful and important new book, The Other Side of Terror: Black Women and the Cultures of U.S. Empire, published by New York University Press 2021. We are, in fact, label mates of this wonderful new book.
Yes.
The legendary Mary Helen Washington writes, "This is a brave and unsettling book, one that makes us think about Black women not as fringe actors or minority figures, but as major players in the global arena." Thank you for joining us today, Erica.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure.
And welcome home virtually.
Yes, it's always good to be back in Durham on campus, even if only in my imagination.
So it is great to welcome you back to Duke, albeit virtually, Erica.
Yes, thank you. Always good to be back.
There's a moment very early in the book when you write about Toni Cade Bambara's Salt Eaters and specifically Velma. And this description of figures like Velma as veterans of the incessant war. And what struck me about this scene, this is a piece that's written in 1978, there's a way in which there's a kind of murky, cloudy history of the civil rights movement that disappears, right? You know, where people try to figure out when the Black Panther Party ended, and then it kind of gets picked up again in the 80s with folks like Jesse Jackson's runs and Public Enemy and Fight the Power and that kind of hip hop nationalism moment. But folks would be apt to think that nothing was occurring in that kind of 10-year period. And the genius of this book is that you pick up on the fact that, you know, Black women never got off the battlefield. They were capturing everything that was happening in what you described, this kind of long war of terror from 1968 to 2012. We just have not been paying attention to those women writers in this way. So talk a little bit about these figures that you chose to pick up on in this book and what you describe as this long war on terror.
Yes, yeah, that's a really wonderful place to start. So this is Toni Cade Bambara writing in 1980 about this character who is a veteran of the civil rights movement, but also in the mix with the veterans of the incessant war, as Bambara calls it, the long war the long war that Black folks are staging against white supremacy, and the long war, the 500-year war on Black life, right? And what's so interesting about Toni Cade Bambara, June Jordan, Gloria Naylor, Toni Morrison, Gail Jones, all of the writers who really gained their prominence in the 1970s and then into the 1980s, is that they are writing about this crucial moment, this crucial conjuncture of what we generally refer to as the post-civil rights period. I think that we have spent a lot of time really thinking about what this period has meant. I mean, your own work has taught us so much about the post-civil rights period, but I'm not sure that we've spent enough time thinking about the deep histories of surveillance, of anti-Black violence, of global anti-Black violence. And I'm not sure that we've spent enough time thinking about the ways that Blackness is, incorporated into that global war of anti-Blackness. And so I became really interested in how it was that Black women writers, Black feminist writers, radical Black feminist writers of the post-1968 period were tuning in with deep attention to, the continuing incessant war and the granular turns that war took over the course of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s.
Eric, how much of that, our unwillingness and inability really to see the full range of Black women's writing in this period of time, has to do with the fact that very often Black feminist writing was framed by what I would say is an ambivalence around feminist politics, so that whenever, Black women writers are brought into the context in this period, it's always in the context of gendered relations within the Black community, right? Even think about the figures who rose to being prominent voices. Thinking Alice Walker in particular in this context, right? And in The Color Purple, it is framed by these tensions between Black men and Black women, often at the expense, of course, of seeing the full range of what Black women are writing about in this period.
Yes, I like to say that Black women's writing during what we generally refer to as the Black women writing Renaissance, right? That it is generally domesticated in two senses of that word, right? It's generally our discussions of that literature is confined to discussions of the home place and all of the intimate relations and problems around intimate relations that stem from the home place. And it's confined to the United States, when in fact, writers of this period were traveling around the globe and writing about these scenes of terror in other places. And in particular, writing about the, again, kind of conscription of Blackness or the incorporation of Blackness into the imperial moves of the United States. So I'm thinking about, Toni Cade Bambara going to Vietnam, smuggling medications in her suitcase, or June Jordan going to Nicaragua to document the U.S. war against the insurgents, right? So thinking about the ways that Black women writers were tracking the moves of an imperial war state, and at the same time attending to the intra-racial violences of gender. It's important to think about both of those things in tandem and how they informed each other.
It's funny. I consider myself a fan of June Jordan's work, have taught her work and written a little bit about her work. And I found myself, when reading your book, going, right, June Jordan, Nicaragua, wait, what? This kind of like, how have we missed this? Particularly in this moment where, Black American thought, if you will, is now global, right? And and for lack of a better way to describe it, has, Black American thought has colonized the world, through a particular Black American lens, for lack of a better way to describe it. And yet still figures like June Jordan writing about a global stage is not being picked up in this moment.
Right. Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with just the way that we have trained ourselves as readers of contemporary African-American literature. And I think, too, that it has to do with what you were just referring to a moment ago, the way that certain kinds of discussions as they related to African-American literature became really central, not only in literature classrooms, but, we're talking about, the daytime talk shows, we're talking about The Color Purple or, For Colored Girls. And so it wasn't simply that there was this, academic story of African-American women writers or of global Black women writers that became dominant. It was also that there was a dominant story in the larger culture that made it really difficult to tell more nuanced narratives about Black women and their interaction with contemporary power. I think it's worth pointing out too, though, that, there are a number of Black feminists who have been really thinking about Black women's internationalism, and especially Black women writers, Shawn Myers, Randy Gill Sadler, Mary Helen Washington, Cheryl Higashida. So I think it's important to note that while our scholarship has been really grappling with the internationalist moves of Black women's writing, we haven't always placed even that conversation about Black women's internationalism in conversation with the rise of counterterrorism as a central modality of US power.
You mentioned the contradiction, right? In one way, Black women's writing becomes material for the US to import a notion of US multiculturalism.
Right.
And very often you also have Black women writing from an international framework, around radical experimental work. And so this work is material for both of these interesting different stages of what's happening in the world. Talk a little bit about those contradictions.
Yes. Yeah, so this study is mainly focused on the post-1968 period, which is what we began talking about. It's during this moment that the United States is in the midst of a larger Cold War project of managing its, kind of image in the global arena, in the arena of world affairs. So as we know from, Cold War civil rights historians like Mary Dudziak or Penny Von Eschen, it's in the Cold War period that the United States adopts a sort of formally anti-racist strategy that eventually matures into like multiculturalism, right? So in order to project itself as the world leader in multicultural democracy or multiracial democracy, the US has to call upon culture to, kind of build consent for that kind of global war or global leadership through war. And so it's, the canon wars of the 1980s really highlight this, large scale, public discussion about the role of culture in, producing an idea of the nation state. And it's Black writers, but it's really Black women writers who are on the front lines of the canon wars, right? Who are, on the one hand, as we were just talking about with respect to, say, Alice Walker or Ntozake Shange, blamed for airing the dirty laundry of the Black community, but on the other hand are often called into, brand new syllabi for American literature classes, or called into discussions about how to, build Black studies programs or how to diversify the university. And so it's, but also beyond the university, it's Black women who are being recruited into the CIA or into the FBI or into social services or into police departments, right? And so it's important to note that as this is happening over the post-68 decades, Black feminist writers are sort of tracking this large shift in power from a model of, segregation to a model of incorporation, and are sort of theorizing the role of literature in smoothing that shift, right? Or, in lubricating that shift, as I like to say. So, I'm thinking about all the Black feminist writers I've already named, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, who are actively writing about the incorporation of difference as a sort of new strategy of power. But I'm also thinking about Black feminist intellectuals in the universities, Hazel Carby or your colleague, my former dissertation advisor, Juanima Lubiano, right? People who spent their careers, have spent their careers really thinking about the nature of power and how power often, sneakily announces itself through these images of Black women's empowerment.
When I read The Other Side of Terror, I hear echoes of charisma in the fictions of Black leadership. Talk a little bit about how you go from that project to this project and what the connective tissue is.
Yeah. So in my first book, I was really offering a feminist critique of charisma as a structuring fiction for Black politics, really asking the question, why is it that despite overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary, we continue to believe that history is made by Black history is made by great Black men, right? What was troubling me by the time I finished that book, which was during the first Obama presidency, what troubled me is that it wasn't just that this ideal of gifted, charismatic male leadership was limiting for Black politics or Black social movements, or even for literary history, but that it was also being easily packaged into public narratives of Black empowerment that were justifying invasion and occupation. So, Colin Powell making the case for war in Iraq, Barack Obama justifying border fortification while accepting the Nobel Peace Prize.
And signing off on drones.
Right. And so then I became really interested in the question, well, given that on the one hand, what we were seeing in Black social movements and in Black public life more generally was the kind of decline of the charismatic leadership model, right? Like I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter, for example. This is a real refusal of the charismatic model of organizing or of telling stories about politics. But on the other hand, we saw this real embrace of the charismatic model when it came to these, narratives of Black public leaders, especially the president. And so then I became interested in the question, well, how do we read African-American literature in this time that has not only normalized, but also made beautiful the, Black involvement with, or the Black intentionality for occupation, border policing, drone warfare, ever proliferating forms of surveillance, et cetera. So I started off this project with this analysis of this book that I do end up talking about in the book, Alice Randall's novel Rebel Yell, which is a story about this kid who grows up as a child of the civil rights movement, the son of a famous civil rights leader, but instead of becoming a major leader like his father, he refuses that path and instead becomes a conservative CIA spy, a Pentagon insider. And it's eventually his job to explain away the torture at Abu Ghraib. And it's at the very end of the novel, he, meets Barack Obama, right? Or I think he doesn't meet him, but I think he watches the big, 2008 race speech. And, he has this moment of oh, there was this other path that I could have walked, as if Obama's path is sort of like a gentler path or a saving grace. And I think it's important to, question that investment in that overinvestment really in Black liberalism, as much as it's important to question that certain investments in Black conservatism.
This is a book in many ways that is about Black women responding to the surveillance state. When people hear the name Gloria Naylor, we immediately think about women in a Brewster Place.
Yeah.
Most folks have no idea that she published a novel, her last novel, 1996, which tellingly, right, given what she wrote about previously in her career, It's not published by one of the mainstream publishing houses, but published by, Hakima Abuti's Third World Press.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about this really interesting book that's about surveillance and paranoia, in the aftermath of the Gulf War.
Yeah. Yeah. So Gloria Naylor, as you said, most well known for The Women of Brewster Place, which wins the National Book Award for, I think it's a, first book, the same year that Alice Walker wins the National Book Award for The Color Purple, right? So, at the height of the Black women's literary renaissance, becomes a household name, right? So several years later, after she publishes Linden Hill's, devastating critique of the Black middle class, after she publishes Mama Day, which is one of the most brilliant novels we will ever read, she goes to the South Carolina seacoast island of St. Helena to work on the novel that she conceived as, her kick-ass novel, the cornerstone of her career. And she was writing about this figure who emerges in Mama Day, who really ties together all of Naylor's work, a figure by the name of Sapphira Wade. So she goes to write the big book on Sapphira Wade, and she purchases this house. She starts working on her garden, and she begins to sense that she's being followed, and that she's being surveilled. And eventually she comes to sense that the National Security Agency is performing mind control experiments on her. And so she eventually leaves, goes back to New York, and sort of fights her way out of this, sense of being messed with, right? Yeah. And so eventually her writing this memoir is her way of processing what happened. And it's her way of reclaiming control over her mind, over her practice. What's interesting is that she will call this a fictionalized memoir, because she tells her story in first person, the story of what happened to her. But she also uses fiction to imagine all the reasons why the US government would be following her and experimenting on her. And so what became interesting to me is that here we have this new literary form of the fictionalized memoir, but it's trying to make sense of the entanglement of anti-Blackness and a kind of larger US state surveillance project. It's also interesting to me that because of what happens on the island of St. Helena, Naylor decides that there's no safe place in the world for her great character, her muse, Sapphira Wade. She never writes that kick-ass novel, or she never publishes it. She does write a good amount of it, but when she gives her papers to the archives at Sacred Heart University, the parts about the character Sapphira Wade are totally missing, right? Wow. So she writes to a friend during that, 1996 experience, as she called it. She writes to a friend, I decided not to work on the novel here because there's no safe place in the world for Sapphira Wade. And it could be that she never felt that there was a safe place in the world for her, even till the end. So I read this as a story of, not paranoia in the clinical sense. In fact, I clarify in the book that, I believe the story that Naylor tells. And the reason why I believe her is that even if we, don't accept that the NSA was performing mind control experiments on Gloria Naylor, we know that the sort of total, penetrative visual control is what the state is after. So even if it didn't happen to her, it could have, right?
Right.
And so I'm less interested in paranoia as a kind of psychological diagnosis. And I'm more interested in it as a kind of orientation to the world. Like, what happens if we agree that there's no safe place for our work? What kind of turns does our work have to take? Or what kind of orientation to our work do we have to adopt?
Great point. It's funny, as we're having this conversation and Condoleezza Rice has reemerged in the world, this time carrying the water for empire around conversations around critical race theory. Yeah. But you write about her memoir and the figure of these exceptional professional Black women, Condoleezza Rice, the fictionalized Olivia Pope, Susan Rice to some extent, Kamala Harris in this particular moment. And you write through the contradictions of Black women's excellence in the service of empire. Talk a little bit about these interesting narratives.
Yeah. So it's over these post-1968 decades that I'm writing about that the figure of the exceptional Black woman, the super high achieving Black woman, that figure really gains prominence as a figure who, in some ways, kind of proves the largesse of United States empire, or proves its beneficence, right? Like, here is the incontrovertible proof of American democracy, right? It's Condoleezza Rice who will often say something like, here I go from being someone who couldn't have a burger at the Woolworths lunch counter to, being, Secretary of State, right? So really proof of this kind of exceptional narrative of the United States, right? So these sort of two forms of exceptionality really meeting in the Black woman's narrative, or in the Black woman's body. And so I became really interested in how, in particular, certain narratives of emergency or exceptionality, like what happens when a kind of sense of emergency endangerment becomes attached to the desire for Black femininity. So I thought about all of the Black women figures who emerge in procedurals and cop shows over the 1980s and 1990s, how we become trained as viewers to expect Black women to save the day, right? And how this, ultimately, I think, reaches a certain, apotheosis in the figure of Olivia Pope, right? As this figure of the television show Scandal, who emerges as this figure of, this figure with the capacity to save, to fix,
but
also, right. But also as this figure who is literally in bed with power, right? And so I began thinking about this sort of role of Black femininity in managing certain anxieties about, attack or apocalypse or the unthinkable. And I think it's really important to think about the ways that Black women, particularly those in high public offices, like the office of the Secretary of State, or the office-like position of the First Lady, how they tell narratives of their own kind of rise to prominence as narratives of this country's exceptionality. I mean, that's how I read Rice's memoirs, right? So yeah.
And it's interesting, right? Because with the exception of Michelle Obama, some of the examples you reference are often untethered to Black life broadly, and specifically untethered to Black men, right? So Black men aren't necessarily in the frame when we think about the exceptionalism of these Black women. What do you think that actually articulates more broadly about these figures?
You mean like what it means that we don't think about Condoleezza Rice?
Or the absence of Blackness and how they are framed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it allows us a kind of, and it allows us to continue to hold on to this idea of Blackness as all that is sort of antithetical to U.S. power or to, empire. I think what's important to note, though, is that in her own understanding of herself, Condoleezza Rice doesn't disavow her Blackness, right? Quite to the contrary.
Right.
And so I think, really where I started this book was like, well, we kind of have to reckon with that too, right? Like, I don't think we can continue to work under the illusion that Blackness always, in every case, provides an out to, sort of the intimacy between, individual lives and the, movement of power. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think if we study Blackness carefully enough, we'll notice how deeply implicated, how deeply intimate Blackness is with the moves of empire. And I think Condoleezza Rice is the sort of perfect case for this, right? I mean, she grows up in Birmingham during the civil rights movement. And it's really because she understands herself as a child of Birmingham Black culture, who is, highly cultivated by a certain understanding of Black achievement. Yeah. It's because of that she can sort of account for her rise to the top of a, global security industry, right? Not in spite of it. So I think it's important to understand that it's the careful management of knowledge about race and the careful management of knowledge about Blackness that is the kind of crucial move of, late US empire, right? It's not the disavowal of Blackness. And because empire moves through that careful management of its knowledge about Blackness, I think we have to be more responsible about how we study empire, right? Like, yeah.
That's a great answer. I've known you long enough to know that you have a particularly fertile mind. So I know you're already thinking about what the next is. But what is next for you, Erica?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I am... I've really been experimenting with just more creative forms, and I'm doing some formal experiments, and the formal experiments that I'm doing right now are around the history of what were called contrabands during the Civil War, or former enslaved persons who fled the plantations. So I've become really interested in all the ways that people circulated and moved and foraged. And I've been particularly interested in the history of Arlington Cemetery, what is now Arlington National Cemetery, as one site of convergence around contraband life. So, Arlington is a Confederate estate that then gets turned over to the Union, and then the Union establishes what's called Freedmen's Village. So I've been really interested in that, transition from slavery to freedom that lots of us have been interested in. But I've been thinking in particular about the ways that sort of walking about and foraging and sort of making social life, on the fly, as it were, really structure that transition. So that's what I'm thinking about these days.
We've been joined today by Professor Erica R. Edwards, Presidential Term Chair in African American Literature at Rutgers University. Previously, the author of Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership, 2012, which received the MLA's William Sanders Scarborough Prize, co-editor of Keywords in African American Studies, published by NYU, and the just published The Other Side of Terror, Black Women in the Culture of U.S. Empire, published by NYU Press 2021, which Mary Helen Washington calls a brave and unsettling book. It is always a pleasure to talk with you, Erica.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.